The impact doesn't just break him, it announces him. Silas hits the floor of the abyss the way a condemned man hits the executioner's block. All at once, every part of him refusing to absorb what has happened. His left side takes the worst of it. Ribs fold inward. The air evacuates his lungs in a single useless gasp, and then there is nothing. No breath, no thought. Just the cold, wet stone pressed against his cheek, and the ringing cathedral silence of a pit that has swallowed men whole for generations. Far above him, impossibly far, light bleeds through the rim of the abyss like the edge of a wound. Gideon's laughter comes down after him, unhurried, satisfied. The sound of a man who has just set down something heavy he was tired of carrying. Silas presses one palm flat against the stone. The arm shakes. Blood moves along the cracks in the floor, slow and dark, threading into the dark like it already knows where it belongs. He doesn't call for help. There is no one left who would answer. The sounds of the abyss return in layers. A low wind moving through tunnels that should have no wind, the distant drip of water, the slow, deliberate scrape of something armored moving just outside the reach of what little light exists down here. Silas turns his head. The shadows at the far edge of the cavern are not still. They are separating. Something enormous steps forward. Jagged obsidian plates catch no light. They consume it. Two eyes ignite in the dark, red as a wound held open. The figure kneels. A gauntleted finger drags through the pool of blood spreading from Silas's side. Slowly, deliberately, it raises that finger, tastes it, then goes completely still. When the voice comes, it is not what the abyss is supposed to produce. It is ancient, careful, almost reverent. The blood of the murdered Luna. It still beats. Hours earlier, the great hall of the Ironveil Pack had smelled like excess. Roasted boar, honeyed wine, the particular brand of incense Alpha Gideon burned at every gathering, something thick and floral that clung to the walls like it was trying to cover something up. The long obsidian table at the center of the hall seated 40, and every chair was occupied by a ranking member of the pack hierarchy. Elders, beta-class enforcers, titled mates, blood-sworn advisors. Candles burned in iron sconces the length of a man's arm. The light they threw was warm, golden, deliberate. The kind of lighting chosen by someone who understood that power is always, first, a performance. Silas stood at the far end of the hall and watched his uncle eat. Gideon sat at the head of the table, taking up a chair that had been widened and reinforced at some point in the last 2 years. Quietly, without announcement, as if the chair's original proportions were the problem. He ate without looking at what he put in his mouth. A drumstick, a fistful of bread, the side of a goblet raised and drained before it was fully set back down. His advisor spoke around him in careful, clipped sentences, and Gideon responded in grunts that his elders had learned, over years of service, to interpret as policy. This was governance in Ironveil. Silas had not been offered a seat. He had arrived at the gathering the way he always arrived, precisely on time in clean but unadorned clothes, Bo standing straight in the knowledge that straightness was the only armor available to a man in his position. Around him, the lower-ranked pack members shifted in their seats without making eye contact. Not hostility, exactly. Something worse. The particular discomfort of people who know a wrong is being committed in the room and have already decided privately that it is not their wrong to correct. An elder named Morrow, silver-haired, thin-lipped, who had served Silas's father before his father had been buried in the kind of quiet, rushed ceremony that asked no questions, glanced up once from the far end of the table. Their eyes met. Morrow looked back down at his plate. That was the shape of it. That was Ironveil. "You're early." The voice came from Gideon's left. Commander Rail, head of the elite guard. He built like a man who had been assembled from parts intended for something larger, did not bother to stand when he said it. He sat with one arm draped over the back of his chair, a goblet loose in his fingers, watching Silas with the flat, measuring gaze of a man who had been told to handle a problem and was deciding how much energy that problem was worth. The summons said midday. Silas's voice carried the length of the hall without him raising it. It's midday. The summons was a courtesy. I see. Do you? Silas didn't answer. Across the table, one of the younger enforcers, 19, maybe 20, still trying to calibrate how much cruelty it was safe to display in the presence of seniors, let out a short, sharp laugh. It died quickly when no one joined it. Gideon set down his goblet. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. He simply shifted his weight and the table adjusted itself around him, conversations quieting, chairs angling fractionally inward, attention contracting toward him the way water contracts toward a drain. Silas. His voice was low even, and carried the precise amount of warmth one might extend to a tenant 3 months behind on rent. You wanted the floor. The floor is yours. This was what Silas had been waiting for. Not the invitation, the trap inside it, the public setting, the full audience. The way Gideon held his goblet during the pause that followed, not drinking, just holding it, making the silence do work that words were too obvious to do. Silas stepped forward. I'm invoking the birthright claim, he said, as the firstborn son of Alpha Kalin of Ironveil. I'm formally requesting the council recognize my standing for succession. The hall didn't erupt. That was the thing about rooms full of people who have been afraid for a long time. They don't erupt. They contract. Conversations stopped at different points, like candles being pinched out one by one. Someone near the middle of the table set their fork down very carefully. Elder Morrow's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he stared at the rim of his plate with the focus of a man doing complicated arithmetic. Gideon looked at Silas for a long moment, then he picked up his goblet and drank. The birthright claim, he repeated, as if trying the phrase out for the first time, finding it quaint. Morrow, walk my nephew through the requirements. Morrow did not look up immediately. When he did, his eyes settled somewhere slightly to the left of Silas's face. The claim requires the petitioner to demonstrate active wolf status, he said, voice flat and practiced. Confirmed shift on record, registered bloodline standing, elder council endorsement. Active wolf status, Gideon said. He looked at Silas with something that was not quite a smile and not quite pity. It occupied the space between them where those two things overlap. You understand why that particular requirement exists. I understand that it was written by an elder council that has served under your administration for 6 years, Silas said. It was written to ensure the pack is led by someone capable of protecting it. It was written to ensure the pack is led by you. A sound moved through the hall. Not laughter, not protest. Something more careful than either. The sound of people recalibrating risk in real time. Rail set his goblet down. You want to be very careful, he said, about the next thing you say. I want the council to acknowledge that this requirement did not exist when my father held the seat, Silas said. He kept his eyes on Gideon. I want it acknowledged in front of everyone in this room that the shift registration law was passed 8 months after my father's death, and that it was passed unanimously by a council whose members received land grants from the Alpha's office in the same quarter. Silence, clean and total. Elder Morrow's hand, flat on the table, pressed down very slightly, as if steadying something. Gideon's expression did not change. This was the thing Silas had studied. This was the thing that made his uncle genuinely dangerous, beneath all the excess and the gold chains and the reinforced chair. Gideon did not react. He decided. He took the measure of a situation from behind a face that gave away nothing, and by the time his expression changed, the decision had already been made and implemented, and the consequences were already moving. He set down his goblet. He stood. It took a moment, the way it always did, because Gideon's body required coordination to rise, the weight of him redistributing, hands on the table's edge, breath coming out through his nose in a controlled exhale. There was nothing undignified about it. He had long ago absorbed his own size into his authority, so that the effort of standing read not as difficulty, but as the deliberate heaviness of a man who moved only when movement was worth it. He walked around the edge of the table. The crowd parted, not scrambled, not panicked, simply parted, the way a river finds a new shape around an obstacle. He stopped 6 feet from Silas. "You have your mother's certainty," Gideon said, almost quietly. She also believed that having the right argument in the right room would protect her. He tilted his head. "You know what Ironveil does with nulls who forget their place? I'm not a null. You can't shift. That doesn't make me a null." "That," Gideon said, "is exactly what a null would say." A few of the guards laughed. It was the permitted kind of laughter, brief, controlled, a social function rather than a genuine response. Rael didn't laugh. He was watching Silas with the careful attention of a man measuring distance. "Show us," Gideon said. The hall went very quiet again. "Show us what you are," Gideon continued. "Right now. In front of the council, in front of the guard, in front of everyone in this room who you want to recognize your claim." He spread his hands, an open gesture, almost generous. "Shift. Show us the wolf, and I will step aside, walk to that table, and personally sign the recognition papers." Silas said nothing. He said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not, in this room, in this configuration of power, sound like what Gideon needed it to sound like. He had carried this his entire life. The biological silence where the shift should be, the absence of something that every other packmate his age had found by 12. He had trained around it. He had built himself around it, learning every other dimension of what an alpha required: strategy, diplomacy, reading a room, holding ground. He had made himself formidable through the parts of him that worked, but the parts that didn't work were the only parts that counted here. Gideon waited the appropriate number of seconds for an answer that wasn't coming. Then he nodded, slowly, as if Silas had confirmed something he had long suspected. "Strip the rank markers," he said to Rael. "Not loudly. The way you say something that has already been decided." Rael crossed the hall in a few strides. His hands went to Silas's collar, the thin cord of braided silver that marked bloodline standing in Ironveil, the one that had been placed there when Silas was 3 years old at his mother's insistence, and pulled. It came free with a clean, small sound that somehow carried the length of the room. Silas did not step back. He held Rael's gaze. He watched the guard's eyes for something, hesitation, apology, the ghost of conscience, and found nothing. Rael was not cruel in the theatrical way of men who enjoy their work. He was simply professional. He handled Silas's birthright cord the way he would handle any administrative task, and stepped back without expression. "The claim is denied," Gideon announced, turning back toward the table. "The petitioner holds no recognized rank in this pack. Any future attempt to invoke succession rights will be treated as an act of aggression against the seated alpha." He reached for his goblet. "Take him out." What happened after that was efficient. 2 guards, hands on shoulders, then arms. Then nothing so precise as that. Just force, organized and impersonal. Silas did not fight. He understood, in the way that a man understands the mathematics of a cage, that fighting here served Gideon's purpose better than his own. It gave the room permission to be relieved. It gave everyone watching a reason to believe that what was happening was the necessary management of a dangerous man, rather than the disposal of a legitimate heir. He kept his feet under him as long as he could. Elder Morrow did not look up as they passed him. The doors of the great hall closed behind them, and the night outside was cold, and the sounds of the feast resumed almost immediately. Voices, laughter, the wet, rhythmic sounds of a table that intended to finish its meal. The world inside had already folded back around the space where Silas had been, and filled it in and moved on. The guards walked him past the edge of the territory lights, past the last torch, past the place where the pack ground softened into something older and wilder and unlit. The first blow came from behind, between the shoulders. The second was deliberate. Rael's men, working in the dark the way they'd been trained, quick and thorough and quiet. No speeches, no monologuing, just the systematic business of making sure a man was too broken to climb back out of what came next. Silas was on the ground when Gideon arrived. His uncle looked down at him with the expression of a man reviewing a completed ledger. "Nothing personal," Gideon said. "Politics." Then the ground disappeared. The ground came back. It came back as stone, cold, uneven, ancient in the way that things buried deep in the earth are ancient, shaped by pressure rather than intention. Silas registered it against the side of his face first, then his hands. Then the full inventory of damage arrived, not all at once but in sequence, the way serious injury always reports itself. A clinical, unhurried accounting of what had been broken and what had merely been destroyed. 3 ribs at minimum. The left side of his rib cage moved wrong when he breathed. Not the clean pain of a fracture, but the grinding, nauseating shift of something that had lost its structural relationship to the things around it. His left eye was already swelling shut. He could feel it in the tightening of the skin, the pulse of pressure behind the socket that beat in time with his heart. His hands were bleeding. He didn't remember that happening. He must have reached for something on the way down. Oh, he lay on the floor of the abyss and breathed in careful, shallow increments and did not move. Above him, the rim of the pit was a distant seam of pale light, the way a wound looks from the inside. No faces. No torches lowered in curiosity. Nothing. Gideon's men had already walked back from the edge. They were already gone, already warm, already folding back into the feast that would resume as if nothing had been set down into the dark. The pack. His pack. 40 people in that hall. 40 people who had watched Rael's hands go to his collar, who had heard the small, definitive sound of the bloodline cord being removed, who had sat in their chairs and kept their eyes appropriately lowered and done the silent, efficient work of deciding that what they were witnessing was not their problem. Elder Morrow, who had stood at his father's right hand for 11 years, who had bounced Silas on his knee at the age of 4 and called him Little Alpha with something that had looked, at the time, like genuine affection. Morrow, who had recited the succession requirements in that flat, rehearsed voice without once looking at the person those requirements were designed to erase. The abyss breathed around him. That was the only way to describe it. Slow, pressurized movement of air from tunnels that opened somewhere deeper in the dark, carrying cold, and the mineral smell of water, and something else beneath that. Something older. The kind of smell that doesn't have a name because the people who could have named it didn't come back up to do it. Silas was supposed to die here. He understood that plainly. Not as a dramatic realization, but as a logistical fact. The abyss was where Ironveil disposed of things it wanted to stop existing. Rogue wolves, criminals whose guilt was inconvenient to prove, rivals. The pack didn't execute, they simply lost people. They dropped them somewhere from which no one returned, and the paperwork described it as an accident or a disappearance, and after a respectful interval, the property transferred and the seat was filled, and the feast resumed. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. The arm shook. He was aware of it shaking the way he was aware of the bleeding, as information, not as feeling. The feeling was somewhere else right now, in a room he had not yet entered, behind a door he could sense but not yet reach. He understood that when he reached it, what was waiting on the other side would be considerable. He did not rush toward it. He pushed, got an elbow under himself, then the other elbow, then one knee which sent a report up through his broken ribs that arrived at the base of his skull as a white clarifying flash of pain. He stopped there, one knee, both elbows, head down, breathing in the specific, careful rhythm of a man who has learned to treat his own body as a problem, to be managed rather than a thing he inhabits. His father had taught him that. Kalin of Ironveil had been many things: a strategist, a fair arbiter of pack disputes, a man who had understood, with a clarity unusual in alphas, that authority is not the same as power, and that confusing the two is how packs rot from the inside. He had also been a man who died badly, not in battle, not with the dignity of a last stand, but in stages, over 18 months, from an illness that the pack healers had managed with decreasing conviction and the quiet understanding that no one above them in the hierarchy was particularly invested in the outcome. Silas had been 16. He had sat at his father's bedside through the last of it, and held the man's hand, and learned, in the wordless education of watching someone leave, that grief does not arrive when the thing you love stops. It arrives later, in smaller installments, in the middle of ordinary moments, when you reach for something and find it gone. He had not had a chance to grieve his father properly before Gideon had moved into the seat. He understood now, on the floor of the abyss, with his ribs shifting wrong and his blood threading into the dark, that he had never been going to get that chance. He had believed, and this was the thing, this was the specific weight of it that he could feel now settling through him like water through stone. He had believed that if he was careful enough, strategic enough, if he built his case with sufficient precision and delivered it in the right room with the right witnesses, the pack's own structure would protect him. He had believed that there were rules. Not laws, rules. The kind of unwritten, bone-deep agreements that hold communities together, that say a firstborn heir is a firstborn heir, that say a man standing in a hall full of his father's packmates and invoking a 1,000-year-old right cannot simply be erased. He had been wrong, not about the rules. The rules existed. He had been wrong about who they existed for. He got himself upright. It cost him. He stood bent slightly to the left, one arm braced against his ribs, and looked up at the distant light above him, and understood with a physical certainty that he could not climb back out of here. Not tonight. Not in this condition. The walls of the abyss were not sheer. There were handholds, ledges, places a healthy man with both eyes functional and no broken ribs could work his way up. But he was not that man tonight. And the pit was deep, and the math was the math. He looked away from the light. He looked into the dark instead, because the dark was what he had, and a man who has run out of good options becomes, rapidly, an expert in the available ones. The sounds of the abyss had changed since he landed. He registered this slowly, the way you register a change in air pressure, not with a specific thought, but with the older, less verbal part of the mind that handles threat assessment. The ambient noise of the pit, the distant water, the breathing tunnels, the occasional scrape of something moving in the deeper passages, had not stopped, but it had reorganized itself. What had been formless background had become directional. Whatever moved in the dark was moving toward him, and it was not moving carelessly. It was being deliberate. Silas did not back up. There was nowhere to back up to, and he was done tonight with the postures of retreat. He straightened as much as his ribs would allow and faced the direction the sound came from and waited. The shadows at the far edge of the cavern were not shadows. He understood this gradually, the way a shape emerges from a painting when you stop trying to see it and let your eyes relax. The dark was not uniform. It had depth, and within that depth something enormous was absolutely still, watching him with the patience of something that does not measure time the way living things do. Then it moved. The Abyss Lord did not emerge from the shadows. The shadows simply stopped pretending to be something other than what they were. A concealment, a courtesy extended to the world above by something that had no obligation to extend it. He was enormous. Not in the exaggerated way of a wolf mid-shift, all fury and biological urgency, but in the way of things that were built for permanence. Jagged obsidian plates covered him from shoulder to boot, the edges irregular and brutal, absorbing what little light existed in the cavern rather than reflecting it. His face, partially visible above the armor's collar, was sharp and pale, and still in the manner of something that stopped aging at a point so distant it no longer remembered what aging felt like. His eyes were red. Not the red of blood, not the theatrical red of dark fantasy paintings. The specific, quiet red of embers. A color that suggested heat, contained rather than expressed, that implied, if you were paying attention, that what you were looking at was not the fire, but the thing that survived after the fire. He crossed the cavern in a few strides and stopped 3 feet from Silas. He looked down. Silas looked up. The Lord's gaze moved over him in the unhurried way of a man reviewing a document. The swollen eye, the arm braced against the ribs, the blood on the floor, the angle at which Silas was holding himself to manage the damage. It was not a sympathetic assessment. It was not cruel. It was the gaze of something ancient that had learned to read the physical world the way a scholar reads text, without emotional investment in what the words described. Then he knelt, one knee on the stone, and the movement itself was strange, not a supplication, not a submission, but something more formal than either. A posture that belonged to a different vocabulary than the one Silas had grown up with. The gauntleted finger moved to the floor, to the blood. Silas watched it, did not move, could not have moved fast enough to matter, even if his body had been intact. Something he understood without embarrassment, the way you understand weather. The finger came up. The Lord's eyes closed for a single suspended moment. When they opened, something had changed in them. Not the color, the quality. The contained heat had shifted, intensified, contracted around something specific. Recognition, maybe, or what recognition looks like in a face that has long since stopped performing its emotions for an audience. The Abyss Lord looked at Silas. Not at the damage, not at the blood on the floor. At Silas, at some quality of him that was not visible in the way the surface world measured visibility. "The blood of the murdered Luna," he said. His voice was quiet, and it filled the cavern anyway, the way a low note on a deep instrument fills a room. Not by volume, but by resonance, by the way it moved through solid things. "It still beats." Silas said nothing. Because there was nothing in his life, not a single conversation, not a single lesson his father had given him, not a single thing Ironveil had prepared him for, that had equipped him for this sentence, said by this creature in this particular darkness, while his bloodline cord lay somewhere on the floor of his uncle's great hall, and his ribs shifted wrong with every breath. The Luna, his grandmother, the woman whose name Gideon had scrubbed from the pack records in the first year of his administration, whose portrait had come down from the hall wall quietly and without explanation, whose grave marker Silas had visited exactly once as a child and never been taken back to. Murdered. The Lord held his gaze and did not look away. and waited with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time already, and did not particularly mind waiting a little longer. Then his free hand moved to his own wrist, and Silas understood in the half-second before it happened that what came next would not be a mercy. It would be something older and more absolute than mercy, a transaction between bloodlines that had been incomplete for long enough that the interest had compounded into something monstrous. The Lord's fangs found his own pale wrist. The blood that welled up was dark, too dark, almost black in the cavern's half-light, and cold-looking in the way that deep water is cold. Not the cold of winter, but the cold of depth, of pressure, of things preserved by the absence of warmth rather than destroyed by it. He held the wrist out. Not an offer, a correction, or the closing of something that should have been closed a generation ago. Silas looked at it. He thought about his father's hand in his, the last night. He thought about Morrow's eyes, fixed on the rim of a plate. He thought about the sound of the bloodline cord coming free, that small, clean, catastrophic sound, and the way the room had absorbed it and moved on. He thought about what it meant that the only thing in the world that had looked at him tonight and seen something worth preserving was a creature that lived in the dark at the bottom of a pit that his pack used to disappear people. He reached out and drank. The cold hit his throat first. Not cold like winter. Cold like the inside of something that had never been warm. The cold of stone that has not seen sunlight in 1,000 years. Out of water at the bottom of a lake so deep that light gives up before it reaches the floor. It went down and kept going, past his throat, past his chest, into the space between his broken ribs, and the pain there did not diminish. It changed. It became something more complicated than pain, more structural. Silas pulled back from the Lord's wrist and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and held very still. His vision pulsed, not dimmed, pulsed, like something inside his skull was pushing against the backs of his eyes in rhythmic, insistent waves. He could feel his own heartbeat in places he had never felt it before, in his fingertips, in the bones of his jaw, in the soles of his feet flat against the cavern floor. The beats were not accelerating, they were deepening, each one hitting harder than the last, Cian like a hammer finding its range. He put one hand on the stone, and the stone felt different, too detailed. He could feel the crystalline structure of it through his palm, the specific texture of individual mineral deposits, the hairline fractures running through it from some geological event, centuries dead. His hand was shaking, and the shaking was not weakness. It was frequency, some internal vibration moving up through his arm from a source he could not locate. What? His own voice stopped him. It didn't sound right. The resonance of it was wrong, too low, too present, as if the cavern were picking up harmonics that hadn't been there before. The Abyss Lord had stepped back, just a single step. He stood with his hands at his sides and his red eyes on Silas, and his expression doing the specific nothing that very old things do when they are watching something they have been waiting a long time to see. Then the blood memory hit. It was not a vision. Vision implies something observed from a safe distance, from the position of a witness with the option to look away. This was not that. This was immersion, total, violent, non-negotiable. One moment Silas was in the cavern with his hand on cold stone. The next he was somewhere else, and the somewhere else was completely real, and his body did not know the difference. A torch-lit chamber, stone walls, the smell of blood and burning herbs, and the specific grief of a room where something terrible is being chosen rather than suffered. The man in the center of the room was old, genuinely old, not the performed age of elders who use silver hair as authority, but the worn, structural age of someone who has been load-bearing for a very long time and is close to the end of what he can hold. His grandfather. Silas knew this without knowing how he knew. The knowledge arrived with the memory, attached to it the way a smell is attached to a place. Not a deduction, just a fact, delivered whole. His grandfather was weeping, not quietly, the ugly, effortful weeping of a man who has not cried in so long that his body has forgotten how to do it efficiently, so that it comes out broken and irregular and entirely undignified. In his arms he was holding a woman. Her hair was dark, her pulse was visible in her throat, slow and struggling, and there was a wound on her wrist. Not a random wound, a deliberate one in the specific location that Silas had just felt against his own lips moments ago in the cavern. The Luna, his grandmother, still alive, still present in this memory with a heartbeat that Silas could feel as if it were his own because it was. Because whatever was in him that the Lord's blood had unlocked recognized her the way a key recognizes a lock, not through choice but through design. His grandfather said something. The words were in a dialect too old for Silas to parse, but the meaning moved through him anyway, carried by the blood. A sentence shaped like an apology and a verdict simultaneously. The words of a man who had been told that his mate's life was a vessel for something that would destroy the world if she kept living, and who had chosen to believe it. His grandfather pressed his mouth to the woman's hair, and then did the thing he had apparently decided to do. Silas's body rejected the memory, lurched away from it the way you lurch away from sudden heat. And he was back in the cavern, both hands on the stone now, head down, chest heaving in the shallow increments his broken ribs permitted. But there was a second image trailing the first, small and almost lost in the enormity of what preceded it. A baby, his grandfather afterward in a different room, moving quickly, a bundle in his arms wrapped in dark cloth, and the particular way he held it, protective, secret, guilty, of a man who had told the world one thing and done another, had said the bloodline ended, had kept one thread of it alive, had hidden it in a family that would carry it forward without understanding what they carried. Silas's father, not executed, spared, hidden, sent forward into a future that was supposed to be impossible. The realization arrived not as a thought, but as a physical event, something in his chest unlocking, some load-bearing structure that had defined the internal architecture of his entire life, simply releasing its tension all at once. He had never been a Null. There had never been an absence. There had been a suppression, the dormant vampire blood running through his lineage lying across his wolf, like a hand over a flame, not extinguishing it, just holding it down, keeping it quiet, keeping it hidden from a world that had been told it was gone. The hand had just been removed. The first thing that happened was his spine. It didn't snap. It expanded, each vertebra separating and receding at a different angle, his entire back reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity that was approximately 4 inches higher than the one he'd had 30 seconds ago. He felt every individual joint in the process, which was extraordinary because the human nervous system is not supposed to have that level of resolution on its own skeletal structure. He was on all fours on the cavern floor, and he could not have stood up if he had wanted to, because standing required an address, and his body was in the process of changing its address. His hands hit the stone as the next wave moved through him. The bones of his hands were wrong. Not broken, restructuring. His fingers spread against the stone of their own accord, forced wide by the remodeling of the metacarpals underneath them. And the stone cracked where his fingertips pressed. Not crumbled, cracked clean fracture lines radiating out from each point of contact, the kind of cracking that requires sustained, enormous, directed pressure. He made a sound. It was not a scream, and it was not anything with a name. It was the sound a person makes when their body is doing something to itself that their mind does not have a category for, when pain and transformation and the complete reorganization of the self are happening in the same place at the same time, and the nervous system is reporting all of it simultaneously. The Abyss Lord did not move. Silas's ribs, the broken ones, the ones that had been grinding wrong with every shallow breath since he hit the floor, straightened. He felt this as a lateral pressure from the inside, like something pushing outward through the damaged tissue, and then the grinding stopped, and the ribs were not just healed, but different. The density of them changed, heavier, as if they'd been recast in a better material, while he wasn't able to object. He was getting larger, not in the dramatic, cinematic way of a wolf mid-shift, where mass appears from nowhere in an explosion of fur and fury. This was slower and more terrible than that. His shoulders broadened by increments he could track. His height increased in stages, 2 inches, 3, then a pause while his body caught up with itself, then 2 more. His clothes pulled tight across his back and then gave up, tearing at the seams with quiet, businesslike sounds. The cold of the cavern, which had been significant and present on every patch of exposed skin, became irrelevant, not because he had warmed up, but because the body he was building had recalibrated its relationship to temperature entirely. The shadow came last. It did not emerge from the dark around him. It came from inside him, from whatever the Lord's blood had unsealed, whatever had been lying dormant in the suppressed lineage for 2 generations, pressing against the inside of a biological lock from the day Silas was born. It came through his skin like smoke through cloth, not detaching from him but extending from him, an atmosphere rather than a separate substance. Black, dense, real in a way that shadows are not supposed to be real, casting its own negative light, eating the dim illumination of the cavern in the space immediately around him. He rose. Not stood, rose. The distinction was in the absence of effort. How one moment he was on his hands and knees on the cracked stone. The next he was upright and the ceiling of the cavern was closer than it should have been, and the Abyss Lord, who was enormous, who had filled the space of the cave with his presence the way a warship fills a harbor, was no longer taller than him. Silas looked at his own hands. The shadow moved around his fingers like water around stone, responsive, present, waiting. He turned his palms up and looked at them, and the cavern responded. The darkness thickening slightly in his direction, oriented toward him, as if the abyss itself was paying attention. His vision had changed. The cavern, which had been barely navigable in the thin light, was now completely legible to him. Every surface, every tunnel entrance, every crack in the stone rendered in a silver-edged clarity that required no light source he could identify. He could see the Abyss Lord's face with complete precision, the ancient contained expression on it. And standing behind the Lord, emerging from the deeper tunnels in absolute silence, arranged in formations that suggested military structure rather than random gathering, others. Dozens of them. The same obsidian armor, the same red eyes igniting in the dark, one by one as they stepped forward, each gaze fixed on Silas with the specific, unanimous attention of people who have just witnessed the thing they were waiting for and are now awaiting instruction. Silas looked at them. They held his gaze without flinching, without the deference of submission, with the different quality of recognition, of acknowledgement, of something owed. Finally delivered. The Abyss Lord moved. He crossed the distance between them and stopped directly in front of Silas and looked up at him, a gesture that must have been unfamiliar to something that old, being the smaller presence in a room, and held that position for a moment that had weight in it. Then he went to one knee. The sound of the obsidian armor meeting stone rang through the cavern like a struck bell. Behind him, in the dark, the others followed. One by one, and then all at once, the synchronized drop of dozens of armored figures to the stone floor, the collective resonance of it moving through the walls of the abyss and up through the soles of Silas's feet. "The block is broken," the Lord said. His voice was still quiet, still filled the space. "The heir of the murdered Luna walks in his full inheritance." He raised his red eyes to Silas's silver ones. "We are yours. We have been waiting." Silas looked at the army of shadows kneeling in the dark beneath the earth. Above him, somewhere impossibly far up through stone and dark, and the distance between what he had been and what he was now, the rim of the abyss was a seam of pale light, and somewhere beyond that light, in a hall strung with gold and smelling of excess, Alpha Gideon was feasting. Silas lowered his hands. The shadow around him contracted, not retreating, settling, organizing itself around him with the quiet efficiency of something that had finally found its correct configuration. "Get up," he said. His voice in the cavern was new. It carried the way the Lord's voice carried, not by volume but by resonance, by the quality of something that expected to be heard. It filled the space the way a tide fills a shore, completely, without effort, without urgency. "We have somewhere to be." They moved through the abyss in complete silence, not the silence of stealth, the silence of discipline, of things that have existed in the dark long enough that noise is a choice rather than a byproduct. The Abyss Lords moved behind Silas in formation, their obsidian armor catching nothing, their red eyes forward, and the darkness of the tunnels did not impede them because the darkness was theirs, had always been theirs. The Abyss had not been a pit that swallowed the dead. It had been a door that the surface world had forgotten was a door. Silas did not rush. Oh, this was the first thing he understood about what he had become. That urgency belonged to people who were uncertain of the outcome. He walked at the pace of someone who has already seen the end of the story and is simply moving through the remaining chapters. The shadow moved with him, around him, ahead of him, reading the tunnels and the stone with the sensitivity that his new body processed as instinct. He could feel the surface above him, could feel the weight of the pack territory pressing down through hundreds of feet of rock. The torches, the structures, the heartbeats of the people up there, going about the business of a night they believed was ordinary. He could feel Gideon's heartbeat specifically, heavy, irregular at the edges in the way of a man who has eaten too much and drunk more than that and is currently in the warm, unearned satisfaction of a feast that belongs to him only because he took it. The heartbeat of a man who dropped something into a pit this morning and has not thought about it since. The tunnel opened upward. The Alpha Summit had been running for 6 hours by the time Silas surfaced. He knew this from the state of the perimeter, the guards rotating to their third shift, the torches burning low in their brackets, the particular looseness in the security formation that accumulates over a long evening when nothing has happened and no one expects anything to. 4 visiting alphas had arrived that afternoon from neighboring territories, each with their own retinues, their own guard details, their own politics. Gideon had arranged the summit specifically for this, the performance of a stable, prosperous, uncontested rule, witnessed by the kind of men whose respect translated directly into regional power. The perimeter torch nearest the eastern tree line went out. Not gutted, not wind. One moment it was burning, and the next it was not, and the shadow where it had been was subtly, wrongly dense. The kind of density that the guard assigned to that post had approximately 4 seconds to register before he registered nothing at all. Then the next torch, then the one beside it. Silas stood at the edge of the tree line and watched the perimeter lights go dark in sequence and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. Satisfaction implied the possibility that things could have gone differently. He was past the architecture of alternative outcomes. He was in the pure structural work of the thing itself. Oh, the Abyss Lords moved through Gideon's elite guard the way water moves through sand, not by force, by inevitability, by the simple physical fact that you cannot fight what you cannot see, cannot track what makes no sound, cannot organize a defense against something that was already inside the perimeter before the first alarm could be raised. The guards were good. Rael had trained them personally, and Rael was genuinely competent in the narrow professional way of men who have devoted themselves entirely to the execution of someone else's agenda. It wasn't enough. One by one in the dark, the outer circle of Ironveil's elite guard was removed from the board. Not killed. Silas had not given that instruction. Contained. Efficiently and without ceremony, because he had not come back to massacre a pack. He had come back to correct a specific error, and the correction required witnesses. And witnesses required that most of the people in that hall survive the night with their faculties intact, enough to report accurately what they had seen. The visiting alphas needed to understand what had happened here. The last perimeter torch died. The great hall stood at the center of the darkened territory like an ember, light bleeding through every window, the sounds of the feast inside dampened but audible. Laughter, the periodic, self-congratulatory noise of powerful men who believe they are among friends. Gideon's voice somewhere in the middle of it, holding court, performing the specific generosity of a host who controls everything on the table and wants his guests to feel the weight of that control as warmth. Silas walked across the open ground toward the doors. The shadow moved with him. Not theatrically, it didn't billow or perform. It simply occupied the air around him the way weather occupies a landscape, and the darkness of the territory organized itself around his path with the quiet deference of something that recognized its own. He stopped in front of the great hall doors. They were heavy oak, iron-banded, built to communicate the permanence of the authority behind them. He looked at them for a moment, at the ironwork, at the pack sigil mounted at the center, his father's sigil, the one Gideon had kept, because removing it would have required acknowledging that it wasn't his to display. He raised one hand and pressed it flat against the wood. Then he took it off the hinges. The doors did not open. They ceased. Now both panels departing their frames simultaneously, the iron hinges shearing at the bolts, the wood cracking along its grain as it hit the interior floor with a concussive force that sent every candle in the hall guttering sideways in the same direction at the same moment. The silence that replaced the feast noise was total. Silas stepped through the frame. The hall looked exactly as it had this morning. Same table, same candles, same iron sconces, same 40 chairs, different occupants. The visiting alphas were at the table's center, 4 of them, substantial men from substantial territories, currently in the process of translating what they had just seen into a threat assessment. Their guards, positioned at intervals along the walls, Dork had hands on weapons they had not drawn yet, because drawing required a target, and the figure in the doorway was not presenting as a target. It was presenting as a context, as the new fact around which everything else in the room would need to reorganize. Gideon was at the head of the table. He was on his feet, had made it to his feet in the seconds between the doors departing, and Silas crossing the threshold, which was faster than his body should have allowed, and suggested that some older, more functional version of Gideon's reflexes still existed somewhere beneath the accumulated weight of 6 years of unchallenged comfort. His chair was pushed back, his goblet was on its side, wine spreading dark across the white linen. His eyes were on Silas, and in them was the rapid, sequential collapse of several beliefs he had held with complete confidence as recently as this morning. The belief that the abyss was a terminus. The belief that a null was a null permanently. The belief that the thing he had dropped into the dark was no longer a variable. Silas let him have the moment. Let the room have it. Let the visiting alphas, who were very smart men, because stupid men did not hold alpha seats for long, complete their assessment of what was standing in the doorway. The height, the shadow moving at his edges like a second atmosphere, the silver eyes that provided their own illumination in a way that eyes were not supposed to. The specific quality of stillness that belongs to things that are not conserving energy because they need to, but because they have enough that the question of conservation is no longer relevant. One of the visiting alphas, older, gray at the temples, from the eastern Greymoor territory, set his goblet down very deliberately and folded his hands on the table in front of him. His guards, reading him, eased their stances by a fraction. He was, Silas noted, the only person in the room who had completed his threat assessment and arrived at a conclusion rather than remaining in the suspended, unresolved state of the others. The conclusion, apparently, was to sit very still and watch. Silas. Gideon's voice came out wrong, pitched for authority, landing somewhere short of it. He heard it himself. Silas could see the moment he heard it, the fractional tightening around his eyes. He tried again, lower. "You should be dead." "I was busy," Silas said. The shadow at his edges moved, not dramatically, just a slow, ambient expansion, the way a fire expands when a draft reaches it. In the periphery of his vision, he could see the hall guards pressing incrementally back against the walls, not retreating, just repositioning, finding more distance between themselves and the doorway without having made a conscious decision to do so. Gideon's jaw set, and then because he was cornered and because cornered men with 20 years of authority embedded in their muscle memory default to the thing that has always worked, he shifted. It was not a graceful shift. Gideon's body did not move through the transformation the way disciplined wolves did. Cleanly, with practiced economy. It moved through it the way his body moved through everything now, with effort, or with the labor of a mass that had grown accustomed to being carried rather than deployed. The dire wolf that emerged was still enormous, dark-furred, heavy-shouldered, the size of a draft horse at the withers, with the particular physical authority of an alpha form that had genuine power in it underneath the excess. Several of the hall guards, reading their alpha's escalation, shifted beside him. 5, then 8, wolves filling the space around the table, forcing the visiting alphas to push their chairs back against the wall. The gray-templed alpha from Greymoor reached out and put a hand on his own guard's arm. The guard did not shift. Gideon's dire wolf lowered its head and moved around the end of the table. Silas watched it come. He did not shift. He did not widen his stance or raise his hands, or make any of the physical adjustments that a man makes when he is preparing to be impacted by something large and fast and furious. He simply stood in the doorway and let the wolf cross the distance between them and noted, with the detached precision of something that has recalibrated its understanding of its own capability, that the enormous creature bearing down on him registered in his nervous system as approximately the level of threat presented by weather. Present. Real. Not the relevant variable. The dire wolf launched. Silas raised one hand. He caught the wolf by the throat. One-handed, the impact absorbed through his arm and shoulder and distributed through a frame that did not move, and held it. Off the ground. The wolf's legs churned at the air, its claws raking his forearm and finding no meaningful purchase. The full weight of Gideon's shifted form suspended in his grip, while the shadow coiled up around both of them, and the wolf began to understand, in the wordless biological language of prey recognition, what it had run into. The hall was absolutely still. Silas looked at the wolf. At the eyes behind the wolf, Gideon's eyes present in the animal face, cycling rapidly through fury and then through something that fury was covering and that the cover was no longer sufficient to hide. He brought him down. Not through. Brought. Controlled. Deliberate, the way you set something down that you are done carrying. The stone floor cracked where the wolf's body met it, a spiderweb fracture radiating from the point of impact, and the shadow pressed down over the prone form like a physical weight. And Gideon's wolves, the 8 who had shifted beside their alpha, stopped moving entirely, reading what every instinct they possessed was telling them simultaneously. "Shift back," Silas said. The words were quiet. They did not need volume because they were not a request, and every living thing in the hall understood that, including the wolves. Gideon shifted back. It was an involuntary reversion, the kind that happens when the dominance gradient in a room exceeds what the shifted form can process, when the wolf itself concedes what the man is not yet ready to concede. He came back to his human form on the cracked stone floor, on his hands and knees, his gold chains hanging forward, his ostentatious dark fabrics torn at the shoulder, his breath coming in the heavy, ragged increments of a man whose body has just been informed of something his mind is still refusing. Silas reached down and took him by the collar. He walked him, not dragged, walked, because dragging implies resistance and there was none, through the center of the hall, past the long table, past the overturned goblet and the spreading wine stain, past the visiting alphas in their pushed-back chairs, past Elder Morrow, who was present at the summit, and who was now sitting with both hands flat on the table, and the expression of a man watching the specific consequence of a specific choice arrive exactly on schedule. Through the ruined doorway, across the threshold, out into the dark of the territory, where the torches were still dead, and the shadow army stood at the edges of the light in formations that the visiting Alpha's guards, following at a careful distance, would spend the rest of the night trying to accurately describe. The ground outside the hall was dirt. Silas pushed Gideon to his knees. It did not require force. The knees went because the weight of what was standing behind him made remaining upright a biological proposition that Gideon's body was no longer willing to make. He went down into the dirt in front of the hall doors, in front of the 4 visiting alphas who had followed, who stood now in the ruined doorway in a row, reading the configuration of the territory with the careful, total attention of men who understand that what they are witnessing is not an incident, but a transition. Gideon's hands were in the dirt. His head was down. Silas stood behind him and looked at the visiting alphas and said nothing for a moment. Because the moment did not require words, the facts of it were self-presenting. The torches dead at the perimeter, the shadow army at the edge of the light, the seated alpha of Ironveil on his knees in the dirt of his own territory in front of 4 neighboring kings, without a god remaining who was in a position to change the geometry of what was happening. "Who are you?" the Greymore Alpha said, "to this pack?" "I am Kaelin's son," Silas said, "firstborn heir of Ironveil, the Null they threw away this morning." The Greymore Alpha looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Gideon in the dirt. Then back at Silas, at the shadow, at the silver eyes, at the cold structural fact of what was standing in front of him, and completed whatever calculation he had been running. He inclined his head. Small, precise. The specific degree of acknowledgement extended between equals when one of them has just demonstrated that the designation is accurate. Silas looked down at Gideon. His uncle's shoulders were moving, the particular movement of a large man breathing too hard in a position his body finds unbearable, trying to locate the version of this moment that he can survive, finding nothing. "The summit is over," Silas said. Not to Gideon, To the room, to the territory, to the 40 people still inside the hall and the shadow army at the perimeter and Elder Morrow, who was somewhere in the dark behind him, doing the quiet, efficient arithmetic of a man who has served under 2 administrations and is preparing to serve under a 3rd. Ironveil's debts will be audited. Its lands will be returned to the families who held them before the land grants. Its healers will be funded. He paused. Its prisoners will be released. Gideon said nothing. "You'll live," Silas said to him quietly, "just for him. I'm not my uncle." He let go of the collar. Gideon stayed where he was. Not from instruction, from the simple physics of a man who has run out of moves and is waiting for someone to tell him what the available options are. The gold chains hung forward from his neck, catching no light in the dead torch, dark, ornate and heavy and completely useless. Silas stepped over him and walked back toward the hall. The shadow followed. The army at the perimeter held their positions, and the visiting alphas parted in the ruined doorway to let him through, without discussion, without hesitation. The way men part for something they have correctly identified, finally and completely, all as the authority in the room. He walked to the head of the table. He did not sit immediately. He stood at the chair, the one that had been widened and reinforced for a different body, for a different kind of weight, and put one hand on it and looked at the hall, at the candles that had righted themselves, at the iron sconces and the obsidian table and the pack sigil above the door, his father's sigil, still mounted where Gideon had left it for the wrong reasons, still the right sigil. He sat down, and Ironveil, in the particular way that packs understand transitions, not through announcement but through the simultaneous, collective recognition of every person in a room that the weight in it has permanently shifted, came home. The candles burned lower. Nobody moved to replace them. Nobody spoke. The visiting alphas had returned to the table, not at Silas's invitation, not at anyone's instruction, but with the quiet, pragmatic understanding of men who recognize a court when they are sitting in one and adjust their behavior accordingly. The Greymore Alpha had reclaimed his chair. The others followed. Goblets were quietly righted. The overturned wine was left where it was, spreading into the linen, because no one wanted to be the person who reached across the table to address a stain while the new Alpha of Ironveil was watching. Gideon had been brought inside. He sat at the far end of the table, not bound, not caged, simply placed in the position that fit the new architecture of the room, the foot of the table, his gold chains still on, his eyes on the surface in front of him, working through a private ledger that was coming up short no matter how many times he ran the numbers. Elder Morrow sat 3 seats to Silas's left. At some point in the last 10 minutes he had straightened his posture by a degree that was not accidental. His hands were folded on the table. His eyes, when they came up to meet Silas's, held the expression of a man who has decided, with the clarity that arrives only when all other options have been foreclosed, to be honest. Silas held his gaze for a moment, then he looked away first, not from weakness, but from the deliberate economy of a man who understands that some reckonings can wait until morning, and that the night has already done sufficient work. The shadow at his edges had quieted, not gone. It would not go, he understood that now. The same way he understood the silver in his vision and the new density of his bones and the permanent, structural change of everything his body had become in the dark. But it had settled into him the way a tide settles after a storm. Present, real, patient, waiting for the next instruction that warranted its full attention. Outside, through the ruined doorway, the Abyss Lords held the perimeter in silence. Ironveil's torches were being relit. He could hear it, the small, sequential sounds of guards who had switched allegiances with the practical speed of people who had not chosen their original allegiance freely. working their way around the territory's edge, restoring the light that the summit had begun with, returning the pack grounds to the appearance of a night that was ordinary. It was not ordinary, but it would not be ordinary again. Silas looked at the table, at the food that had not been cleared, the feast that had been interrupted mid-sentence, at the chair that had been built for a different body, at the sigil above the door. He thought about his father, not with grief, or not only with grief, with the particular complicated quality of feeling that arrives when you complete something on behalf of someone who could not complete it themselves. When you carry a thing the full distance and set it down in the right place and understand, standing there, that the person who handed it to you would have recognized the destination. He thought about the woman in the blood memory, his grandmother, the Luna, whose name had been stripped from the walls. That name would go back up. He didn't say this aloud. It didn't need to be said aloud tonight. It was the kind of decision that belongs in the quiet after the battle, in the private ledger of the things a man intends to do when the room stops watching. There would be time. He had, for the first time in his life, the machinery of time on his side. Not borrowed time, not the conditional time of a Null permitted to exist at his uncle's sufferance, but the full, open horizon of a man who holds what is his and knows how to keep it. The Greymore Alpha reached for his goblet, drank, set it down with the deliberate, measured motion of someone initiating a conversation that everyone in the room has been waiting for. Ironveil will need a formal coronation, he said. Not a challenge, an observation. The professional shorthand of a king who is already mentally filing tonight under political developments requiring follow-up correspondence. Ironveil will get one, Silas said. The other regional alphas will have questions. They can bring them here. A pause. The Greymore Alpha considered this, then again the small incline of his head. The acknowledgement of a man who has run the numbers and found them sufficient. The hall settled further into its new shape. Somewhere outside, a torch caught and held, and its light came through the nearest window and moved across the table in a slow, warm bar, crossing the white linen, crossing the obsidian surface beneath it, reaching the far end of the table where the wide, reinforced chair sat empty, and Gideon sat beside it in an ordinary seat, diminished to the size of what he actually was. Silas did not look at him again. He had nothing left to say to him, and nothing left to take from him, and no further use for the particular satisfaction of watching a corrupt man understand the consequences of his corruption. That chapter was finished. The accounting was done. What remained was the construction, the harder, slower, less cinematic work of building something worth protecting out of the wreckage of something worth burning down. He was ready for it. The candles burned. The shadow god of Ironveil sat at the head of his father's table in his father's hall, under his father's sigil, and let the night finish itself around him. And the dark outside, the deep, patient, ancient dark that had swallowed him this morning and returned him as something the surface world did not have a word for yet, held the perimeter in silence, waiting, as it had always been waiting, for whatever came next. Alpha Gideon called him a Null. He threw him into the dark and went back to his feast. And the dark gave him back something that the surface world is going to spend a very long time learning how to deal with. Drop a comment right now. Did Gideon get exactly what was owed, or did Silas let him off too easy? Because there are two kinds of people watching this, and I need to know which one you are. If you're already pledged to the hybrid empire, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and stay close. The throne is taken, but the reign is just getting started. See you in the next chapter.